Entonces, damos paso a la última conferencia de este taller a cargo del doctor David Neslin, quien desafortunadamente, como saben, no nos puede acompañar físicamente en el taller por temas de salud. El doctor Neslin es exdirector de la Comisión de Conservación de Petróleo y Gas del Estado de Colorado. En el momento se encuentra como socio de la firma Davis, Graham & Stubbs en Denver. Él es historiador de la Universidad de Washington y es Juris Doctor cum laude de la Universidad de Washington. Como director de la Comisión de Conservación de Petróleo y Gas de Colorado, el doctor Neslin trabajó en el desarrollo de regulación para el sector energético para promover un desarrollo responsable, mejorando significativamente los tiempos de procesamiento de permisos y desarrollando regulación en fracturamiento hidráulico, la cual es considerada un modelo a nivel nacional en los Estados Unidos. El título de la presentación del doctor Neslin es Desarrollo sostenible produciendo energía mientras se protege el medio ambiente.
Yes, can you see me?
No.
All right. Are we ready to start?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is Dave Neslin. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. I had a health issue come up this week that prevents me from traveling, so I'll have to make my presentation by video conference. I will be in Colombia in several months for the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Institute conference this spring in Cartagena, and so hopefully I will see some of you there. I'm going to talk to you today about how we produce energy while protecting the environment in Colorado. Let's go to the second slide, which shows several maps of the United States. And these are maps prepared by the U.S. Energy Information Agency, and they depict the unconventional gas plays that are underway in the U.S. today. The first map shows major tight shale gas plays. In the lower left, the map shows coal bed methane plays, and the lower right shows shale gas plays. And the takeaway is that there are numerous unconventional gas plays underway across the United States, and these are pervasive. They cover virtually the entire nation, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest. Let's go to the next slide, which is a map of Colorado. And you'll see that the same is true of Colorado. Now, Colorado is about 1/4 the size of Columbia. We have a very diverse geography with flat agricultural land on the eastern part of the state, mountainous terrain to the western half of the state, the Rocky Mountains bisecting the state from north to south. The yellow dots on this map are oil and gas wells, producing oil and gas wells. And today, Colorado has about 48,000 producing oil and gas wells. And Colorado is in some ways a microcosm of the United States in that we have multiple unconventional gas formations and plays. So in the upper right portion of the map is the Denver-Julesburg Basin, which has shale gas. In the southern part of the map, to the southern part of the state, the San Juan and Raton basins are coal bed methane or coal seam gas plays. And the northwestern part of the state, the Piceance Basin, is a tight gas play, tight gas formations. So Colorado has a diversity of unconventional gas resources that are being developed today. Let's go to the next slide, which explains a little bit about Colorado's role as an oil and gas producer. Colorado has a 150-year history of production. The second oil and gas well drilled in the United States was drilled in Colorado over 150 years ago. Today, as I mentioned, we have more than 47,000 active oil and gas wells, and about 3,000 new wells are drilled each year across the state. Our production last year was almost 1.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which was the fifth most in the United States, and over 39 million barrels of oil, which was the ninth most in the United States. So we are a major oil and gas producing state. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time, we're an international outdoor destination. We're known for our ski resorts and our mountains and our national parks. We have over 50 14,000-foot mountains across the state. We have 4 national parks and 41 wilderness areas. We have world-class wildlife populations with elk, bighorn sheep, trout, cutthroat trout, golden and bald eagles. And so the outdoors is very important to us, both socially, economically. Our wildlife and fishing and skiing and mountains and forests, many tourists and many visitors. And so it's equally important that we protect these resources. So the Oil and Gas Commission, which is the state agency that regulates all oil and gas development in Colorado, has a dual mission. The mission of the Oil and Gas Commission is both to facilitate the development of the state's oil and gas resources by private companies, and also to ensure that that development occurs responsibly in a manner that protects the environment, that protects our public health and safety. Let's go to the next slide. It's a picture of a crowd at a rulemaking process. Now, during the past 12 years, Colorado experienced a dramatic increase in oil and gas development. In the year 2000, Colorado issued approximately 1,000 drilling permits, and there were maybe 30 drilling rigs operating. By the year 2007, the state was issuing 6,000 to 8,000 drilling permits a year for new wells, and there were 140 drilling rigs operating across the state. So there had been a dramatic increase in oil and gas development during a relatively short period of time. And oil and gas development and concerns about the environmental effects of that development became a political issue frequently. So I was talking about in 2008, in response to a significant increase in oil and gas development, Colorado comprehensively updated its regulations to increase environmental protection and transparency and efficiency. And this was the largest rulemaking activity in the state's history. At the same time, the state reorganized the Oil and Gas Commission. Now, the Oil and Gas Commission is a group of commissioners who are appointed by the governor, and they approve regulations and they set policy. And then the agency, which consists of 70 professionals, actually does the regulation and does the work on a day-to-day basis. The commission was reorganized as part of this process. Previously, it was a 7-person commission, 5 of whom had to be from the industry, or associated with the oil and gas industry, 2 of whom did not have an association with the industry. As reorganized, the commission has only 3 of the commissioners are associated with the industry. It's important that some commissioners have industry experience because this is a very technical and dynamic industry. But we added 2 commissioners from the governor's cabinet. And we added other commissioners who had diverse backgrounds and skills. One had to be a local government official. Another had to be a farmer. A third had to be a member of an environmental NGO. And a fourth had to be experienced with soils and reclamation. So we made our commission broader and ensured that they had more diverse experience because the kinds of issues that the commission had to address no longer were simply downhole engineering issues. They were fundamentally policy issues about how we balanced energy production with environmental protection and how we coordinated with local governments, how we protected wildlife, other types of policy issues. That change was very innovative at its time. Most state commissions are comprised wholly or largely of individuals with experience in the industry, technical experience. And so this was something new to have oil and gas commissioners with the breadth of different backgrounds that we added. But I can tell you that it has worked well during these past 4 years. Our commissioners have brought new skills and new perspectives, but they've worked well together and have continued to reach unanimous or nearly unanimous decisions. Let's go now to the next slide, which is titled Developing Draft Rules. So the first step for us was to develop draft regulations that would totally and comprehensively update our regulatory program. This process took about 8 months. It involved more than 40 staff from 3 different agencies: the Oil and Gas Commission, a separate agency in charge of health and environment, and a third agency in charge of wildlife and biodiversity. We went through several steps to facilitate public input and public comment, and there was extensive public participation. We held public meetings in each of the major geologic basins across the state that were attended by some 1,700 individuals. We had almost 40 technical meetings attended by specialists on behalf of the industry, the government, local governments, local NGOs. And we received more than 2,000 written comments. We also prepared a very extensive cost-benefit analysis, looking at the potential costs of different regulatory approaches and the possible benefits. We took all of that information and developed a set of draft regulations. And then our commission spent about 8 months adopting and finalizing these regulations. Let's go to the next slide, which is titled Adopting Final Regulations. And again, we spent about 8 or 9 months with our commission adopting these regulations. They went through multiple iterations. They changed significantly from the initial draft to the final version. And as part of this process, our commission, 24 days of commission hearings, many hours of public comment, testimony by more than 160 expert witnesses. They spent more than a week deliberating and working through rules. And during this period, we, the staff, continued to meet regularly with all of the different stakeholders. I myself probably met on more than 100 occasions with representatives of oil and gas industry and individual companies. And I met on dozens of additional occasions with local government officials and representatives of environmental NGOs and agricultural groups and others. And at the end of the day, we adopted a comprehensive set of amendments. So several things helped make this process successful. First, it was legislatively authorized. The Colorado legislature directed the commission to update the regulations, and all political parties supported, to some extent, the updating of the regulations and voted in favor of that legislation. Second, we had a very inclusive process. As I mentioned, we met on dozens of occasions with all stakeholders, including the industry, local governments, environmental NGOs, agricultural interests, and others. And third, we worked very hard to see that our commissioners unanimously approved the regulations. Taken together, these three factors helped move the commission more to the center. They helped us become more practical, and they helped make the regulations more practical and commonsensical. Second, they added credibility. So both the process and the final regulations became more credible and attracted the support of newspapers, the media, and other opinion shapers. Now let's go to the next slide, which is environmental standards. Now we amended over 100 regulations, and I'm not going to try to take you through all of those different changes. But I do want to focus on 5 or 6 different areas, which I think are important. And so let's go to the next slide, regulating hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing has become the touchstone issue for unconventional oil and gas development. We can't develop our unconventional resources without hydraulic fracturing. And hydraulic fracturing is what has allowed us to produce these resources, which are so abundant. At the same time, hydraulic fracturing is an industrial activity and has raised a number of concerns on the part of environmental groups and the public. And it has been the subject of great disinformation and misinformation, and I think confusion. We addressed hydraulic fracturing through the amendments to our regulations in several ways. First, the most important way we protect the environment, and groundwater in particular, during hydraulic fracturing is through proper construction of the well and proper construction of the well bore, casing and cementing of the well bore. That is the first line of defense for the environment. So we added several new regulations to help the state do a better job of ensuring that wells are properly cased and cemented. For example, we require operators to submit cement bond as part of their application to us, so that our engineers can confirm the adequacy of the cement coverage. Second, we require operators to monitor the well pressure during the hydraulic fracturing treatment and to report any significant changes in well pressure that might indicate a release of fracturing fluids. So well construction is very important. A second important aspect of this is chemical disclosure. Now, I don't believe that chemical disclosure is critical to protecting the environment, but I do believe that it's important to developing public confidence and public assurance. And I do believe that the development of these resources requires public confidence and public assurance. So it was very important that we address chemical disclosure as part of this process. And we actually addressed this issue twice. As part of our amendments 4 years ago, we required operators to maintain inventories of the chemicals they use downhole, to provide that information to the state, to professionals upon request. Last year, we came back and additional regulations. Regulations require operators to report the chemicals in hydraulic fracturing fluid to a publicly available website, www.focus.org. And through that website, members of the public can look up on a well-by-well basis the chemicals that were used to hydraulically fracture. They can obtain additional information on hydraulic fracturing and can link up to the regulations that govern hydraulic fracturing in Colorado. So we require public disclosure of this information. As do most other states today. Third, we often get complaints that their water well has been contaminated by oil and gas. When people raise these kinds of complaints or raise these kinds of concerns, we have scientific data that we can use to demonstrate what the water quality was before oil and gas was developed. And so we expanded a requirement that companies sample groundwater before they begin
Creo que debemos
wells. I had been talking about the importance of groundwater sampling. And so Colorado requires operators to collect groundwater samples before oil and gas wells are drilled, and then again after they've been drilled and completed. And that provides us with scientific data that we can use to assess concerns about groundwater impacts. And if someone alleges that their water well has been impacted by oil and gas development, we have actual data that we can use to assess that claim. And then last is a group called Stronger. Stronger is a group comprised 1/3 of state regulators, 1/3 of industry representatives, and 1/3 of environmental representatives. And they audit state oil and gas environmental regulations on a voluntary basis and make recommendations to states on how they can improve their regulation in terms of protecting the environment. And so we went through an audit or review by Stronger, as many other shale gas producing states have done recently. And that's a way of ensuring that we're using best regulatory practices and helping to harmonize regulatory approaches. Let's go to the next slide, which is titled State Casing and Cementing Depths. Now, this is a map prepared by a group called Resources for the Future. And this depicts how different states are regulating well construction requirements, and specifically casing and cementing requirements. And you'll see most oil and gas producing states have regulatory requirements for casing and cementing. And there's some variety in those requirements in terms of the depth to which the surface casing has to extend, but great similarity in approach. Let's go to the next slide. That's a slide on state fracturing fluid disclosure. And again, it provides similar information on how states are requiring the disclosure of hydraulic fracturing fluid chemicals. And you'll see that most oil and gas producing states now have regulations that require the disclosure of this information. And again, there may be some variation from state to state in how they approach this, and the details may differ slightly from state to state, but generally states are requiring this kind of disclosure. Let's go to the next slide, groundwater testing. And again, this is similar information on groundwater testing. And you see that it's not just Colorado that requires groundwater testing, but again, most oil and gas producing states have requirements for groundwater testing. In some states, these requirements are imposed by regulation and apply across the state. In other areas, they are imposed by regulation, but only apply to certain areas. And in other areas, these requirements are imposed by permit or on an individual or site-specific basis. So again, the takeaway here is a great deal of similarity in terms of how different states are addressing these issues, some difference in detail from state to state. Let's go to the next slide, which is captioned Protecting Water Quality. This was the second major environmental area that we addressed in updating our regulations. I think there's general agreement on the part of most regulators and even many environmental groups today that the principal risk to water is not from hydraulic fracturing, because hydraulic fracturing in most of the United States is occurring about 1.5 miles below the surface of the earth. And the drinkable groundwater, the groundwater aquifers, are typically less than 1,000 feet deep. So there's great geologic separation that helps protect groundwater from hydraulic fracturing. The greater concern to groundwater and surface water are surface spills and surface releases of waste fluids and produced water. And so we adopted a number of regulatory amendments to require operators to better manage their waste. We encourage them to move from waste pits to pitless drilling systems that use tanks. Where operators do use pits, we required them to use thicker liners to construct better foundations, to do a better job of maintaining those pits. We require secondary containment at the well site so that there is multiple layers of protection for soils and groundwater. We updated our spill reporting and our soil and groundwater standards. We did all of those things to better protect water quality. And if we go to the next slide, again, this is a resource for the future map depicting state pit liner requirements. And this is depicting the thickness of the liners that is required by regulation. And you'll see, again, many states have regulatory requirements, and the thickness requirements range from about 20 milliliters to about 40 milliliters. Let's go to the next slide, state spill reporting requirements. This is a similar slide depicting state regulatory requirements. In Colorado, we require spills to be reported within 24 hours under most circumstances. And most other states have similar requirements where they're requiring prompt reporting of any spills or releases. And we're not just talking about chemicals here. We're talking about water which may contain hydrocarbons. We're talking about produced water that may contain high salt levels and which can be a contaminant. So spill management is very important. Let's go to the next slide, which says protecting air quality. Now, air quality is the third major environmental issue that we addressed. I think this is an emerging issue in the United States that has attracted growing attention during the past year and is likely to attract further attention in the years to come. There are two kinds of air quality concerns associated with unconventional resource development. First is diesel emissions from the motors and engines being used to drill the wells and to hydraulically fracture the wells. So those are diesel emissions containing volatile organic compounds and ozone precursors. The second concern is fugitive emissions of methane, methane that may be leaking from equipment, or methane that may be vented after a well has been hydraulically fractured, but before it goes into production, or for some exploratory wells, methane that may be vented because it's not economic to extend pipeline facilities to the wellhead. And so the operator is seeking to produce oil or liquid hydrocarbons and vents the methane. That's a concern because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so we adopted several requirements to try to minimize these air emissions. First, we require green completions in certain areas. Now, green completions are a technique where after a well is hydraulically fractured and before it goes into production, rather than allowing the methane to vent into the atmosphere, the operator captures the methane and puts it into a pipeline for ultimate sale, or utilizes it on site as a source of energy. And we require operators to do that where it's technically and economically feasible to do so. In other words, where they have a sufficient infrastructure where they're operating close enough to existing pipelines that's feasible. We require them to do green completions. Second, we require operators to install emission control devices on certain types of production equipment. And these devices combust or ignite methane and other air emissions, thereby reducing the impact on the atmosphere. And so we adopted several of these regulatory requirements. Other states are doing the same. The federal government in the United States recently adopted a similar green completion requirement that will apply nationwide beginning in 2015 and require green completions on most wells. The federal government has also adopted certain emission control requirements, as have many other oil and gas producing states. And so if we go to the next slide, state venting regulations. Again, this is a resource for the future map depicting differences in how states are regulating the venting of methane into the atmosphere. This is, again, a topic that's receiving growing attention at the state and federal levels. The next environmental issue that we addressed was wildlife. Let's go to the next slide, which is captioned Protecting Wildlife. I mentioned at the outset that Colorado has very significant wildlife populations. These are very important to our citizens and to tourists and visitors. And so we wanted to ensure that operators were doing as much as possible to protect wildlife habitat when they develop resources, when they develop oil and gas in these areas. And so we adopted regulatory amendments requiring operators to avoid the most critical wildlife habitat where it's feasible to do so, requiring operators to consult with the state wildlife agency on other sensitive habitat, and requiring operators to implement best management practices and specific types of mitigation in all instances. Let's go to the next slide, promoting transparency. Now, I've talked for the past few minutes about environmental regulation and protecting the environment. To me, just as important is extending transparency. I think for these unconventional resources to be developed successfully, the public has to have confidence that the resource is being responsibly developed and the environment and people's health is being protected. And I think to develop that kind of public confidence will require greater transparency. And so as part of our regulatory amendments, we did several things to promote more transparency. We provided that all drilling permit applications submitted to the state would be posted on the internet and available to the public over the internet. We ensured that local governments and nearby surface owners would receive individual notice of drilling permit applications. We provided an opportunity for the public to comment on permit applications. And we did several things to better coordinate with local governments. We wanted to better incorporate and integrate local concerns and local issues into the state regulatory process so that the state permitting decisions could take advantage of local perspectives and local concerns and could address those concerns. We think that will make for better protection of the environment, and we think that will also help to avoid disputes between state and local governments and hopefully dissuade local governments from attempting to develop their own conflicting or duplicative requirements. So transparency was very important. Let's go to the next slide, encouraging landscape planning. This is another area that we tried to address with our regulatory amendments. There are many benefits from attempting to encourage operators to plan on more of a landscape level basis and for states to regulate on more of a landscape level basis rather than on a pad by pad or well by well basis. Looking more broadly at the landscape is more efficient. It can create greater predictability for the operators, which is beneficial to them from a business standpoint. It can help the government to better address cumulative effects from development, incremental development across the landscape. And by looking more broadly, we believe that it can help facilitate more win-win solutions rather than win-lose solutions, where everyone benefits. And so we created several planning tools, things called geographic area plans, which are specific regulations that apply to one geologic basin but not others, comprehensive drilling plans that allow operators to work with the state on a drilling program that might address thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, and wildlife mitigation plans that allow operators to work with the state on plans to develop energy in wildlife habitat while providing additional protection for those wildlife species. And again, to have those discussions at the beginning of a drilling program to work out mutually acceptable arrangements at the beginning of the drilling program and thereby provide greater certainty and greater confidence for both sides. Let's go to the next slide, improving permitting efficiency. As part of our rulemaking update, we also recognize the need to increase the efficiency of our permitting process. As you've probably heard in this program, unconventional oil and gas development is very resource and capital intensive, requires significant amounts of capital and funding to undertake. And so it's important that we encourage operators to make those investments and to continue to make those investments in Colorado. And one way we try to do that is by providing a reliable and timely permitting process. And so we made several changes. We, as part of our permitting process, distinguished between surface environmental impacts and below ground issues dealing with groundwater protection. We added staff and adjusted our process to eliminate bottlenecks and backlogs. And we extended the duration of our drilling permits from 1 to 2 years. And collectively, we were able to cut the average permitting time down by about 60%. So we shortened up the average permitting time by about 60% while doing a better job of protecting the environment and addressing site-specific issues. Let's go to the next slide. Several things, it's captioned several things that help make these rules successful. And I want to talk about, why I think these particular amendments have worked well for Colorado. First, they're tailored to local basin, landscape, and community needs. And the regulations apply differently in different parts of the state. I mentioned at the outset, Colorado has a very diverse geography and geology. And so we have flat agricultural land, we have mountainous recreational land. And it's important that the regulations apply differently in these different areas because there are different issues and different concerns. You've probably heard the phrase, one size doesn't fit all. And I firmly believe that when it comes to oil and gas regulation, one size doesn't fit all. Regulations need to address site-specific issues and should be tailored to different basins and landscapes. Second, our regulations balance prescription with performance. Now, historically, the United States has had a prescriptive regulatory philosophy, sometimes referred to as command and control. We describe in very specific detail what we want operators to do and how they should do it, not just with respect to oil and gas development, but with respect to many kinds of industrial activity. Eastern Europe is very similar. Western Europe, in contrast, has traditionally been more performance-oriented, where they set targets and they leave it to the operators to figure out the best way of accomplishing the target or objective. Now, both prescription and performance have benefits. Prescriptive approaches are very detailed. They can create greater certainty. They can make it easier to enforce and ensure compliance for the state. Performance can encourage innovation, and it can encourage operators to find more efficient and effective solutions that benefit everyone. So we determined what we really needed was a balance of the two approaches. And so we have regulatory requirements that are highly prescriptive. Our casing and cementing, downhole casing and cementing requirements, for example, are very prescriptive. And that's appropriate because we have lots of experience in that area. We have other requirements that are much more performance-oriented. An example would be wildlife, where we have less experience regulating the dynamic between energy development and wildlife. And so those are more objective or performance-oriented standards that provide more flexibility. In a number of cases, we've provided for both. So for example, waste pits, we have very prescriptive pit construction and pit lining requirements. But we also allow operators to obtain alternatives or to obtain variances from those requirements where they can demonstrate to the state that their proposed approach will provide equivalent protection. So that's a way of combining prescription with performance. Third, we put a lot of effort into implementing these regulatory changes. We implemented them over the course of a year. We did a significant amount of training with operators and training with our staff. We prepared written guidance on a number of issues. We phased in requirements gradually because we did not want to create sudden disruptions in the way companies were currently operating and doing business. We wanted a smooth transition. And if that meant that it took a little longer to implement certain requirements, that was a cost that we thought was a reasonable and appropriate cost, so long as the new requirements were successfully implemented in due course and in due time. Let's go to the next slide, results after 3 years. Now, you sometimes, there's a public perception on the part of some that energy development and environmental protection are irreconcilable, that we can either develop our energy resources and despoil the environment, or to protect the environment, we have to forego the energy resources that we all use and that provide significant economic benefits to us. Colorado's experience is that we can do both. In the 3 years after we substantially updated our regulations, we are producing more energy than ever before. We've had a 30% increase in oil production and a 10% increase in gas production, notwithstanding the economic recession of 2008 and continued very low natural gas prices. Colorado has had more new oil and gas wells started than any surrounding state. At the same time, we're doing a better job of protecting the environment, and we have statistics that demonstrate that. The use of pitless drilling systems, which are using tanks for waste fluids rather than pits, has more than doubled. We've gone from pitless drilling systems being used in about 30% of the new wells to pitless drilling systems being used on more than 70% of the new wells. Based on a sample taken earlier this summer, about 61% of the fracturing fluids were being recycled, and about 85% of the well completions were green completions. Operators are doing a better job of siting wells further away from buildings and neighborhoods. And operators have worked out 14 wildlife mitigation plans with the state, which cover more than 750 square miles of some of our best wildlife habitat, allowing energy to be developed in those areas while providing enhanced protection for the wildlife. So we're demonstrating that energy production and environmental protection is not an either-or proposition, it's a both-and. We can both produce energy and protect the environment. Now, let's go to the next slide, monitoring and compliance, because that's an important part of this dialogue. Let's go to the next slide after that, Colorado well reporting. Colorado, like other states, require operators to submit a number of reports to us. Operators have to submit written reports after the well is drilled, which describe the actual casing and cementing practices that were implemented and provide additional data on the geotechnical conditions that were experienced. After a well is hydraulically fractured, another report must be submitted, and that provides additional detail on the fracturing fluid source and the disposition of the fracturing fluid flowback, more information on the fracturing process, as well as whether green completions were used. And then during production, we require monthly reports on the amount of gas and water being produced and the amount of gas flared. And last, we require operators to submit annual compliance checklists in which they certify that they are complying with the most important environmental regulations. I'm a big believer in obtaining lots of data. I think if we have data on issues, we can better measure how performance is working out in practice, and we can adjust our management accordingly where that's necessary. So I think it helps add to public confidence. It helps add to the government's ability to manage this kind of development and ensure that it's occurring responsibly. Let's go to the next slide, inspections and complaints. Colorado has a robust inspection program with 18 full-time inspectors located throughout the state. They conducted over 17,000 well inspections 2 years ago, where individuals submit complaints to the state because they think they're being impacted or there's a problem at a well site. The state responds within 24 to 48 hours. The state will typically do water testing and analysis. Those individuals have a right to a hearing if they're dissatisfied with the state's response. Let's go to the next slide, number of wells per inspector. Again, this is one of the Resource for the Future maps depicting differences in staffing, inspection staffing among different states. And again, you'll see some variation in terms of the number of inspectors that states have per well. And let's go to the next slide, increasing regulatory resources. Really the takeaway here is that in the United States, many states are increasing the size of their regulatory programs for unconventional oil and gas development. I know John Hanger, I think, is there from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had more than 100% increase in the size of its regulatory staff, as did Ohio. In Colorado, we increased the size of our staff by about 50%. Arkansas increased the size of its staff by about 40%. So most major oil and gas producing states are expanding the size of their staff to keep pace with increasing levels of activity. And typically, the funding for that is coming from the industry in the form of either fees or taxes or other costs that are assessed for development of the resource. Let's go to the next slide. Tools for improving performance. I just wanted to highlight here a growing proliferation of different regulatory reports, benchmarks, and comparisons that provide information on comparative regulatory practices and best regulatory practices. Now, I've already described Stronger, the group that audits state regulations, state oil and gas regulations, and provides reports and recommendations on improving environmental programs for that purpose. That's one such tool. The Oil and Gas Compact Commission is an organization comprised of the oil and gas regulators from all of the oil and gas producing states in the U.S. They provide They hold regular meetings twice a year and provide an opportunity for regulators to share information on emerging issues and strategies. There have been a series of reports. The Resource for the Future report is identified here. The University of Texas's report on fact-based regulation for environmental protection is included. The American Petroleum Institute has issued a number of guidelines and reports making recommendations and creating guidelines for appropriate development of the resource and various technical issues. And an environmental group, the Environmental Defense Fund, and an oil and gas operator, Southwestern Energy, have jointly developed what they call a draft model regulatory framework for hydraulic fracturing. So there are a number of these tools available now to states or countries like Colombia that they can look to, again, for comparative information and information on best regulatory approaches that they can use in updating your regulations. And I think, these provide great models. They provide a lot of good information. And had we had some of this information available to us 4 or 5 years ago, this would have significantly shortened up the time that was required for us to update our regulations. What we're seeing now in the United States is whereas 5 to 10 years ago, states updated their oil and gas regulations about every 5 to 10 years. Today, states are updating their regulations every year or two. So in the past 4 years, Colorado has updated its regulations, adopted significant updates on 3 years, so 3 out of 4 years. Pennsylvania has significantly updated its regulatory program on several occasions during the same period, as has West Virginia, Ohio, and other states. Let's go to the next slide, education. This is a final topic I want to touch on, and it is kind of woven through much of what I've had to say here. I think unconventional oil and gas development is very important. It holds enormous prospects and enormous promise for our countries in terms of providing affordable supplies of energy, creating good jobs, providing needed tax revenues, invigorating our manufacturing industry. There's public concern as drilling moves into new areas. And the internet is not just a source of fruitful source of information, it can be a source of misinformation as well. And so I think public education has become increasingly important. And I think states and countries have to be involved with this type of public information. I don't think it should be left to the industry. I think it's an important part of state regulatory programs as well, to reach out and educate the public on issues of concern associated with unconventional oil and gas development. And so in Colorado, we issued a number of reports during the last 4 years on emerging issues. Some of you may have seen the documentary Gasland. Gasland depicted several situations in Colorado where they alleged in the movie that people's water wells had been contaminated by oil and gas development. These were situations that the state had investigated, and we knew that well impacts were unrelated to oil and gas development. So we issued a report responding to the Gasland film and attempting to correct the record and explain what the facts were, and provide the public with information on hydraulic fracturing and how the state regulates hydraulic fracturing and why we believe that the environment is being responsibly protected. We issued a similar report with respect to water well, not water well, but water impacts, spills, releases, on responding to newspaper stories on spills and releases, and using it as an opportunity to explain our regulatory program and how impacts are addressed and remediated and what the relevant regulations require. We issued similar reports on water consumption. Water is actually used for energy development. And how people should maintain their water wells and provide information to water well owners who might be concerned about energy impacts. So we issued a number of these reports, which I think were well received and were very helpful. We met with the press regularly to provide background information to them on emerging issues and to ensure that the press understood our regulatory program. And then we spent lots of time meeting with the public at the local community level. So last year, we probably attended dozens of local community meetings to participate in local dialogues on energy development, share their perspective, and attempt to ensure that the public had facts. Okay, I've spoken for about an hour there, and I would be happy to answer any questions. And again, I apologize for having to do this over video conference. I know this has not been optimal. Hopefully you've been able to follow along, and you should now have copies of the PowerPoint and slides anyway.
Muchas gracias, doctor Neslin. Les pido un aplauso así no esté aquí presente y a las traductoras que le digan que lo están aplaudiendo.